Hello, New York Giants fans. Welcome to the Everything New York Giants podcast with New York Giants fangirl. I'm your host, Adrianna. Today we have a very special guest, Alex Rollins. For those of you who don't know him, he does film breakdowns for NFL and college, and he specifically did one centered on the Giants recently. So I'm excited to dive into that. But quickly, Alex, I would love to just hear from you how you got into this work and how you enjoy working on all the film breakdowns.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, Adrianna. And by the way, I did have a bagel with some schmear this morning to kind of get in the zone a little bit. So I started a long time ago. In 2016, I did this thing called NFL Scouting Academy, and it just kind of introduced me to the all 22 angle, which is what I use in my videos. And it just kind of blew me away. Like, it's so hard to watch the broadcast copy and know what's going on. Like, a lot of the guys run off the screen, and it just kind of shook me. I was like, oh my God, we're missing so much by just watching what's happening on television. So I slowly started making crappy videos, and a couple of them got a couple of views, and I kind of just kept going from there.
And now you have 115,000 subscribers on YouTube. So the videos that I've seen have been wonderful. They look excellent.
Don't keep watching because they just get worse, but I appreciate that.
Well, I actually did just go back and watch the Giants one. And when I listened to your introduction, I was like, as a Giants fan, this is hard to hear that they've been one of the biggest losing teams in the last decade outside of the Super Bowl. As Giants fans, we know this. You know, I've watched every game for probably the last decade and then some. And it's a harsh truth and a brutal reminder, but trying to go into this season with optimism. But the video, for those of you who didn't see it, so what Alex did was he broke down the offense under Daniel Jones last year and talked about all of the reasons why it didn't work, where there were a lot of reasons. And I would love to hear from you, you know, after watching the all 22 tape. Like you said, it's so different than what we're watching at home or what we're watching at the stadium. What you saw that really stood out to you, aside from, you know, the obvious Evan Neal making wrong tackles, Daniel Jones can't get the ball out fast, you know, the offensive line being a disaster, you know, wide receivers running wrong routes. There's this big misconception, I think, with Giants fans that Daniel Jones is the sole reason why this team cannot win football games. And he is only a piece of the puzzle. So I would just like to hear from you, you know, what you think about the Giants and what you've seen, you know, last year, if you have any sort of hope for them going into this year.
Yeah, Adriana, no, it's a great question. I think the main thing is, generally when you're doing YouTube videos, you are kind of going in with an idea, and then before you actually start producing it or researching it or whatever. And the idea initially was why Daniel Jones can't get off his first read. Mm-hmm. And I try and be as open as possible when I'm breaking down the film and not just staying with that main idea. And as you said, it was a lot of different things. It wasn't just Daniel Jones. It really was a situation where he wasn't put in a situation to succeed. And the offensive line was really bad. They couldn't protect for him. As I mentioned, he was pressured 45% of the time. That's one of every two snaps, basically. That was in the top 2 in the league. He was sacked 15.8% of the time. That's one of the highest numbers in the last 5 years in the NFL. So the offensive line wasn't able to protect for him. The receivers, I think a main issue when we look at 22 success versus 2023's failures, I think the Giants really doubled down on what they were trying to be. And that was a good team, right? They won a wild card game against the Vikings, of course.
Yeah.
But if you're not progressing in the NFL, you can't just maintain that same level of talent or success, if you will. You're not going to be able, if you're not growing, you're basically declining. So I think the Giants saw their team. They gave Jones the huge deal. They got Saquon back. And then if you look at the acquisitions they made, they had Darren Waller. They had so these pieces didn't really pan out. Jalen Hyatt. It didn't really progress the team in any way. And I think when you look back at what they were, it was really just trying to recreate what they had in 2022. And I think teams caught up, honestly.
Yeah, that was a narrative going around to, I think, this offseason. is, last year they basically brought the team all back together. It's the same coaches, same everything. And, I think fans are going into it thinking, okay, this is a good thing because now there's finally going to be some consistency after having a new head coach every 2 years, having all of these different types of issues and injuries and all sorts of things that, I know I personally felt like, okay, we're finally going to have some continuity. Maybe we're going to have some success here. And then the opposite happened and everything went wrong. But I think from this offseason, there's a lot of talk of what this offense is going to be without Saquon. And I personally am in the camp that, you can't rely on one person to win every single football game. So I think it was the right move. And I'm curious to see how this offensive line and everything comes together as a whole. But I think you talked about the receivers not running the right routes. And I want to get into that a little bit because I'm not an expert when it comes to route running, and I'm sure a lot of fans are not as well. So can you just kind of point out like what you saw on the tape and if you think that that's something that, to me, that seems like a very fixable issue, right? Like, we heard Jalen Hyatt say that he went into Daboll's office halfway through the season because he thought he did something wrong and he was upset that, he wasn't getting more targets and this and that. And then we start to see more of him the second half of the year. But I think what you pointed out was a perfect example of that, was that when you're not running the right routes and you're not doing the right thing when you're on the field, you really shouldn't get more playing time.
Yeah. So I think what's really important for NFL fans to understand is every single play has a set footwork by the quarterback, and the play is really revolved around that. So let's say Daniel Jones is supposed to take 3 steps. The routes are supposed to come open at that time. So his first read, let's say he takes 3 steps and there's a curl. That curl is supposed to be breaking open right when he gets to the top of that drop. Let's say the curl isn't open, he takes a hitch. Then that's how he progresses to his second read. So the entire framework of the play is really set around his footwork. And when you're watching the film or even the broadcast copy, you can see he'll get to the top of his drop sometimes. And as you said, Jalen Hyatt is still taking a couple steps and then coming open. So if you're Daniel Jones reading the play, you see him, he's not even turned around. You can't anticipate him turning around because you don't know. He's already run the wrong route, so you're not really sure what's going on. If the timing's all messed up, Daniel Jones then doesn't really have confidence in that second read coming open because he's kind of thrown off. So that's a really critical aspect of things. There was an example I had in the video where sometimes the execution of the play was messed up as well. Sometimes the way Daboll installed the concept just didn't really make sense, where instead of running a go route, a guy would run a stutter go where he'd chop down and then keep running. And it would just, these little timing elements really made it more challenging for Daniel Jones to really progress. So I think that's a really important aspect of things. And another stat I want to throw at you. So in 2022, the Giants, Daniel Jones specifically, had one of the highest rates of passes 1 to 9 yards down the field. It was at like 48 or 50%, which is really high. It was top 3, I believe. So as I said, they doubled down, right? They kept their offense. They kept their playmakers for the most part. That number jumped to 58% this year, which was by far the most in the league. And so they really limited what they wanted to do. And especially if you're running your entire offense 1 to 9 yards down the field, you have to have very, very specific timing. You have no margin of error because A, the defense knows you're not going to be throwing the ball down the field. And B, within 3 steps, that's a 2-second play. The ball has to come out now. If the guy is a foot off of where he's supposed to be, off his marker, it's going to ruin the entire thing. And we saw the Giants struggle in that area in 2023.
Yeah, and that was a big complaint from fans too, is that no, out of the 3 quarterbacks, not a single one of them really threw it down the field. I mean, we saw maybe a handful of plays throughout the entire season. So I'm curious to see how that develops this year. And, I think some of the moves that they made at offensive line are going to help that. But I've had my complaints with Daboll as head coach. I'm a little worried about him taking on play calling duties this year because I feel like it's one more thing to add to the pile. And when, there are things I'm worried about, I'm not so sure that that's the best idea. But Do you think that something like the timing of plays, like, does that really fall on Daboll, or is it more on the players not necessarily knowing the playbook? Because from what I've heard, Daboll's offense is one of the hardest to learn in the league. It's very difficult. The playbook is very long. So do you think that all of that is part of it?
It's always challenging, and it makes my job hard because the coach could be the best coach in the world and he could have maybe not the smartest players, or the coach could just be installing things wrong and the players are on it and they're just like, hey, what the hell's going on? I think it was the players. I think, as we said, some of those instances were Hyatt, as the example you mentioned. So I think that was the issue at times. And yeah, I think Daboll, when you look at the progression of the offense from year 1 to year 2, I think he didn't show that maturation you would like to see as a head coach, where always you want the arrow pointing up, right? Obviously it started pointing down. I think that another thing when watching Daboll too, he gets very emotional, and that really happened that first year. I think those things start to tie in too. I think when you don't have a grounded head coach who's comfortable, just if they're losing, if they're winning, I think those things, being a first-time head coach, I think those aspects start to seep into what's going on behind the scenes a bit. So I think, hey, maybe if he's frustrated with Hyatt or with a rookie or with a new receiver who's starting in this offense and they're not doing their job in the exact way, maybe he is overloading them a bit and giving them too much to think about. And then we see these weird things on film where a guy isn't where he's supposed to be and he's not at his landmark, etc.
Yeah, that we saw a lot of that on Daboll, and that, when you're watching at home and they're showing the way after Jones threw an interception that Daboll throws the tablet at him, and then you see him, yelling at Tyrod during the Bills game as they're walking in to halftime, and like he can't even get it together to talk to the sideline reporter. Those are the things that start to concern me a little bit. So I know from everything that I've heard, there's been a big concerted effort this offseason that's something that Daboll has to work on. And I'm sure it's coming from ownership and it's coming from everywhere. But that's one of the things that I really hope that he works on moving forward, because the Giants have one of the youngest rosters in the league. And there's been complaints from fans as well that some of these young guys are not really developing. So I think now there's these question marks of, well, if the offense is really that difficult and, someone like Jalen Hyatt is making mistakes out there, then maybe you have to pare it back and maybe you have to make some changes to figure out how to get these players to play to the best of their ability. And, I think the offense was so bad last year that all of it was part of it. But I want to talk about Evan Neal for a second, because as fans, we have seen the mistakes that he's made. And, everyone basically calls him a turnstile and like he shouldn't even be out there anymore, which is probably fair. But I didn't realize until I saw it up close in your video the way that Bellinger even turned to him and said, you're supposed to be going for the C gap. And I think to see that, to see it so blatantly in front of you, it's very hard to look at that. It's someone in year 2 was a top 10 pick who had so much success at Alabama, to see them do things like that. So when it comes to Neal, from what you saw on film, what do you think about him?
Yeah. And what blows my mind about that play too, I'm pretty confident that was in the first week of the year. And I mean, you have the whole offseason, you have all of training camp, you have that first week to prepare, to just not be on the same page. I mean, the C block is a very common concept. It's possible that it was just too loud in the stadium and they suddenly made a late audible between the two of them or something. But to not be on the same page in that situation, it jumps off the screen. It's surprising. For Evan Neal, it's tough. The college game is so different than the NFL game. There is a lot more that is put onto a lineman's plate, anybody in the offense plate, a quarterback's plate. And I think it goes back to what we're talking about. I think it's possible that Daboll, A, as you said, isn't really developing these players in the correct way. And then B, is maybe putting too much on his plate. Maybe he's thinking about 4 different things before the play starts, and he doesn't hear Bellinger, or him and Bellinger are making too late of an audible, or if the mic comes down, Bellinger says, hey, C block, and he just doesn't hear it because he's thinking, what if the Will comes? What if the Sam comes? So I think in that instance, I think there is a chance that he's thinking too much out there. We do see the physical ability, at least from college, that he is a massive guy. He can move really, really well. And football is a very mental game. And if your coach isn't preparing you correctly or isn't developing you in the right way, and I'm about to go on a tangent here, okay? We didn't really talk about this. The Giants' Hard Knocks has been pissing me off. And
Okay.
I just want to say, and I want to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Okay.
But the one part of Hard Knocks, which does tie into what we're talking about, when they had Shane Bowen come in, the new defensive coordinator, and they said, what kind of guys do you want? That's just not how football teams are run. The general manager is supposed to set each position and say, hey, for my right tackle, I want a massive body who can move laterally, et cetera, et cetera. Or, hey, we need a run blocker at right tackle, maybe not as much as a pass pro type of right tackle. It's things like that. It's the general manager's vision, because he's ultimately the guy who's curating this roster and getting the proper talent for each position. So to have Shane Bowen come in and say, hey, what do you want? If Shane Bowen gets fired in 2 years, then where are we? I mean, if we had Wink Martindale come in a couple years ago, if we created the entire defense around what he wanted, then now we're screwed, right? We have all Wink Martindale guys. So yeah. I think you can even go back. I liked Evan Neal coming out. I think he is a talented player. But I think if there isn't this top-down philosophy from the general manager of saying, hey, this is what we want, we need this out of this guy, he doesn't really have a path to grow, because they're kind of making him grow in different ways. They're not setting an expectation and then having him a path to move forward with. So I think it kind of gets back to the development piece of what we're talking about, where it's you need to be going in a certain direction, and it feels like the Giants kind of always aren't. I mean, They did double down on what they wanted, but then Saquon was the identity of this offense, as we've seen in Hard Knocks, right? That was their guy. Now he leaves, and I think I'm curious what they'll do with Malik Neighbors, but I'm also worried because it feels a little, there's not much of a path forward of like, what is our identity? And that's what concerns me.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting because Joe Schoen has always said since he's been here that he has a plan. And, it sounds like from what we can understand, it was, minimum of a 3-year plan. And I know Giants fans are so sick of hearing that we're in a rebuild, but when you have 3 different coaches in 6 years, and you have different general managers and all of this different stuff coming in, like at some point you have to stick with one guy and say, all right, we're going to see this plan out and see how it goes. But I'm very curious to see how things go this year, because it seems like they were all in on Evan Neal. Like, he was their guy. They drafted him, obviously he has to play better, but he's our guy. And then in Hard Knocks, when Shane is talking about free agency and talking about bringing in guards, or, talking about Luminor and John Runyon Jr., he's talking about the building blocks of the offensive line and Andrew Thomas and John Michael Schmitz, and Evan Neal is nowhere to be heard. So that is, I think, a concern from my end, because I like Joe Schoen and I think that he deserves the time to figure it out and keep going with this plan. There's some question marks there, no doubt, but I'm like, you went all in on this guy, a top 10 pick, and now 2 years later, going into year 3, there's still a huge question mark around him. And now you're talking about him maybe not even being here in the future. So I think if it doesn't work with Evan Neal, that's going to be a huge stain on Joe. Obviously, the Saquon thing is going to be part of it. If this offensive line can't do anything, if the run game sucks and Neighbors has 0 catches, it's going to be very ugly. And I'm hoping that's not the case. But there's definitely a lot of concerns, I think, of that moving forward. And it's hard to tell with Hard Knocks, because there are some conversations that I'm like, this did not really happen. This was all staged for the camera. When him and Daboll are sitting in the office and Shane is saying to him, okay, so we're definitely moving forward with the offensive line. Like, that's the priority in free agency. And Daboll's like, thinking about it, like, yeah, we need interior guys. I'm like, this is such BS. There is no way that this is how this conversation went down the day that free agency starts. So I'm with you on that. Like, I don't know how much of that Shane Bowen scene was true. I don't know how much of it he is running the show. We know that with Wink Martindale, I think Kayvon and Tay Banks were big Wink guys. He was all in on the two of them. Same thing, bringing in a guy like Jihad Ward, that was all for Wink's scheme. But I do think, guys like Kayvon and Banks, I think ultimately are going to be fine. I think bringing in Burns, there's no question that this team needs to get to the quarterback. So I think those things are going to help someone like Kayvon, who maybe wasn't utilized to his best with Wink.
Yeah, I saw somebody too say it was kind of like watching guys in like a fantasy football draft, and that kind of like they're just like, hey, like, this defense, look top 5 in run defense and top 5 in pass defense. It's like, yeah, those are numbers, but like, you're not really like orchestrating a plan or like putting a plan forward. Or it's like, hey, do you like this guy? They're like, yeah. Which once again, as you said, it could be for the cameras, but that's not how things work. It's a plan that's put in place, and then they figure out how to execute that plan. And then you say, hey, okay, this guy can fit our scheme. This guy can fit what we want to do in this way. And then we can develop him into the future in the 2-3 year window or whatever. But it just seems like, this guy's kind of coming in and out of the office. I was like, what are these guys doing? Like, they're just kind of sitting around, and they're kind of just like, yeah. Jaden Daniels said he seems pretty good. We might as well, trade the farm for him. Like, it seems like guys hanging out. It seems like my idiot friends in high school just sitting around and trying to build an NFL football team.
Yeah. Well, then, with the quarterback thing, like with Drake May and Daniels, and they're showing like some of the interviews, but not all the interviews. I think it's very hard to get a feel on how authentic the show really is, especially when you know that John Mara and Joe Shane had final say on what gets aired. So I think it's fun to get an inside look. It's different than anything we've seen from Hard Knocks. So I know, like, from my perspective as a fan, it's fun to watch. It's enjoyable to see some of the behind the scenes things and stuff that we probably wouldn't see. There's definitely those question marks of like, what is really going on here? But I want to talk about Wink for a second, because I don't know what Joe Shane's plan coming in was, but I do believe that everything that happened with Wink was a big hiccup with that. So do you think that everything that went down with him and having to bring in someone else, and it sounds like maybe they missed out on their top defensive coordinator options. I still think Shane Bowen was a good pick, but he wasn't my first choice at the time. Do you think that set them back in any way? Or like, maybe upset this plan that they had?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the NFL as a whole, the coordinator turnover is pretty crazy. I mean, we get guys and offensive coordinators or defensive coordinators taking head coaching jobs, and that kind of can change everything. And that goes back to my point of it starts with the general manager of setting the plan, and then Wink Martindale executes that plan. It's not, hey, we're giving the keys to Wink. He's going to take the guys he wants, and then we're going to go from there.
Right.
So I think it's based on what I said before. I think it is problematic. I'm not doubting Shane Bowen's philosophy or abilities as a defensive coordinator, but once you're suddenly just shifting everything, I mean, for example, let's say we have a defensive end whose job is to rush the passer. Or okay. I guess with Wink, it would be different. So let's say Wink's guy is more of a run blocker. He's supposed to beef up and supposed to get in 2 gaps. He's supposed to hit a right tackle and just hold him up and stay in 2 gaps and make sure a running back doesn't get through either gap. Then a year later, if Shane Bowen comes and you're saying, hey, we're all systems go. We're going to the quarterback. You're rushing the passer. This guy's developed in a certain manner of, hey, I'm supposed to be a run blocker. I'm beefing up to be able to knock guys back and not necessarily get past them. He's not working on his pass rush moves. He's not working on his body the same way. So it's those kind of things. It always, what I love about football is things kind of blend together. It's not just, hey, is Daniel Jones good or bad? Hey, is Shane Bowen a good or bad defensive coordinator? If the general manager isn't putting that plan together, now Shane Bowen has to work with Wink Martindale's guys. Then we're suddenly shifting the whole plan. It I want a general manager who comes in and sets the plan and says, hey, this is what we're doing. Shane Bowen, this is our scheme that our guys have been developing in for the last 5 years or 3 years or whatever. How can you add something to our scheme rather than just take over the scheme and put in your own scheme? It's strange. So I think Shane Bowen showed with the Titans he is a good defensive coordinator. But once again, and we are on a Giants podcast here, so Giants are obviously going undefeated. But I'm a little bit worried about just the strategy of the team, I'd say.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a lot of question marks of like, we went from being such a blitz heavy defense with Wink to now we're going to go from all of that to being a 3-4. How is that going to change? So it's going to be interesting. Okay. So with all of that being said, let's end here. What do you think the Giants are going to do this year?
Well, I told you 17-0. I mean, that's obvious, right? What do I think they're going to do this year? I think
everyone stays healthy, which in my opinion, that's the biggest thing. If Daniel Jones goes out and we have Tommy DeVito or Drew Lock back there, like I'm not going to have much hope. I'll say that.
Yeah, I think it's going to be somewhere in between the wild card year or the wild card win year and then last year. I think we need to see this team progress. I think we need to see them. I think they really doubled down, as I said, on what they did in 2022. And I think if they're not going to change things up and just kind of keep going with that model, I'm worried. I can see a outcome easily where they just throw a million screens to Malik Neighbors and hope that he's just the guy and just breaks freaking 20 tackles every play.
Yeah.
He is a talent. He is a very talented player. I actually liked him more than Marvin Harrison Jr. So I think there is a lot of talent there. I'm excited about him. Mm-hmm. But with the Giants, I think that we can look back historically and just see what they've been the last 10 years and be worried, to be honest with you. But I'm hoping. I have a lot of hope. Yeah,
I think there's a common sentiment around the fans too. Like in theory, we brought in better offensive linemen. We brought in Malik Neighbors. They brought in some good players that, Brian Burns. The hope is it's all going to come together this year. But until I actually see it with my own two eyes, I'm not so sure that I believe it. And camp starts tomorrow, so maybe we'll get our first preview of hope.
Yeah, I think some of the moves too, and I agree that Hard Knocks is definitely edited, definitely some of it's for the cameras and whatnot. It does feel like there's a little bit of desperation going on. I love Brian Burns. He's an awesome player, but also that also felt like a bit of a move of like, dang, I'm about to get fired if we lose this year. Like, we need Brian Burns. We need to make some big time moves because this is obviously the defining year for general manager and head coach. So.
Yeah.
It felt there was a whiff of desperation. But once again, Brian Burns is incredible. But just mortgaging a bit of the future for a team, that move is pretty much saying, hey, we're going to win this year. And TBD.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting. I think one of the biggest question marks for the last 5 years and now this year too is Daniel Jones. And if he has a bad year or if he gets injured, there is going to be fire Shane and Daboll and bring in Belichick. And that is all that will be heard from this fan base, not me, but from others throughout the rest of the season. So I'm not prepared for that. Not yet. I'm hopeful, but if it doesn't go well, I think that will be the case.
Well, let's hear your prediction. What do you got?
I could see them going 9-8. I don't necessarily think that they are going to win the NFC East. I don't think they're a playoff bound team. I just have too many question marks until Evan Neal can actually block someone, until the offensive line as a whole works, and we see success with Jones and Neighbors and some of these other wide receivers. Like, I need to see it with my own eyes. I'm not as worried about the defense. I think that we have better building blocks there and better talent as a whole, guys who have played together for the last few years. But I am still concerned about the offense. And now knowing Daboll is going to be calling plays, I also have that concern with him too. It's a lot on his plate. Can he handle it? I am not so sure.
We'll see.
Yeah, we will see. Thank you so much for joining me. Everyone, you can find him at Alex Rollins NFL, and it's Alex Rollins NFL on YouTube too, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So you can follow him there. And thank you guys for listening.